Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Elijah Williams. I'm reporting your news. Thank you for tuning into Shot 5, where we're excited to enter a new year, but we're also pleased looking back on our past decade. Today's date is December 31st, 1955. We're going to start today's segment with some information on the ecology and societal growth of the 1950s. Alana?
Thank you, Elijah, for that wonderful welcoming. During this decade, the environment was not as good as it was today. It was constantly building. It was either pollution being thrown around in nature or cutting down the trees. But overall, it was worth the economy. Now let's talk about the societal change that happened in the 1950s. From all the fashion, cars, music, and movies to the equality rights for women, the Cold War, and the Civil Rights Movement. Now let's take a look back on the fashion in the 50s.
Out of the gloom came the new look. Then the shadows lifted and controls were cast aside. And as one new line followed another, the British fashion industry revolutionized itself. It isn't just that its fabrics and its workmanship are good, its price is down to earth. British women take all that for granted. But in the last few years, we have become the most fashion...
In the video, our clothes have changed tremendously since the 50s. In the 1950s, men's fashion moved towards a more casual, day-to-day style, while on the other hand, women's fashion prioritized elegance, formality, and perfectly matched accessories. Balenciaga and Dior showed off their novel prints and color, which brought attention and fashion for both men and women. Nowadays, driving on the road, you will see people driving a Nissan, Honda, Kia, Cadillac, Camaro, Malibu, Jeep, Ford, or Toyota. Back in the day, the popular cars were Buick, Mercury, and Chrysler. From the effects of World War II, the United States was about to embark on a musical journey that would change the face of music. Racial tensions were being strained due to the Civil Rights Movement, and music was being reflected upon that. People believed during the 50s that the white artists stole music from the African Americans and capitalized on it for their own benefit in a way that the original artists could not. The top three music genres that were played in the 1950s are rock and roll, who featured mainly Elvis Presley and Chuck Berry, traditional pop with Nat King Cole and Peggy Lee, and then R&B, you had Ray Charles and Sam Cooke. Let's take a quick look at the 1950s science fiction movie Target Earth.
Hey, wait a minute!
Keep away from me. Don't come any closer.
Take it easy. I'm not going to hurt you. That's more like it. Now calm down.
Let me go. Please.
Relax. I am not going to hurt you.
Then why did you chase me?
But why did you run?
I was afraid. That girl in the street, I thought...
That I killed her? Now, look, it will make you feel any better. Think this over. If I had killed her, I'd be miles away from here by now, wouldn't I?
Popular films that people go out or sit back on the couch to watch were science fiction, horror, or fantasy films. It started out flavored with Cold War paranoia in the beginning of the decade to a monster movie towards the end of the decade. Women's rights were minimal. They were not allowed to buy or sell property, make contracts, or even have a workforce job. Their job was to be a homemaker who cared for the children while the men were away fighting for the country. During World War II, women were allowed to enter into the workforce and record numbers. Although once the war was over, most women had returned back home and their job was taken over by men. Now on to the Cold War, which led to the great fears that affected the Americans. The 1950s were dominated by the four powerful changes in American life. The four were the birth of the Cold War, the dramatic growth of influence, a growing anxiety among many Americans who felt their lives were too constricted, and the emergence of a new subversive culture growing beneath the surface of the decade. Lastly, the civil rights movement, where African Americans spoke out against inequality and injustice during this decade. There was segregation where the whites and blacks were separated. Whites used violence and intimidated the blacks to prevent them from asserting their rights. They had been fighting against racial discrimination for centuries, but for the 1950s, the struggle for their racism and segregation entered the mainstream into American life. Now let's go to Jillian, who will be talking about religion.
Thank you, Law. Now going into the religion in 1950s. In 1950s, they used the saying, "In God we trust." "In God we trust" is on every dollar bill, so we see and use it all the time. This was a very powerful saying. It made a lot of people see it all the time, so they believed in it more. And in today's world, it is still used. During the Eisenhower administration was the same decade that the National Prayer and Breakfast was launched. This was very important part in the decade. It really just brought attention to religion and what he believed in, and so other people would choose whether or not they believed in the same thing. According to Kevin Cruz and his new book, One Nation Under God, with the original Pledge and Alliance. So this book really just opened up many portals and different paths for people to take, and whether or not they believed in this religion or that religion, they kind of just made their own decision, and people would either agree with them or not agree with them. Going along with the disagreement in religion, the ministers sent out a message that basically said that the Christianity and capitalism should be together and that they're soulmates. A lot of people kind of really looked at them with a third eye and did not understand the similarities that they had. These two religions were very different but also the same. This case really took a toll on people's aspects of the different religions and made other people realize what path they wanted to go down and what religion they wanted to choose. Other people did not agree with anything that those people were saying. They agreed with the ministers. They wanted to have the capitalism and Christianity be together and become soulmates. Now, in today's world, that is kind of what is very similar in the religion now, although that's not really what's been said by people, like that these two religions should be together, things like that. It's kind of like I believe in this, so you should believe in this, and that also starts a lot of arguments, just like how when the ministers said that capitalism and Christianity should be together, it started a lot of problems and arguments in basically everyone's lives that were Christian and capitalism religion. So now jumping into economy with Aiden.
Thanks, Jill. Following years after World War II, the economy is flourishing. With more comfortability and freedom, the baby boom had begun, which created the rise of suburban culture. With President Eisenhower in office, effective ways to boost the economy were put in place. One of the most famous being the investment in the interstate highway system. During this period of time, our country recorded a 37% growth in economy over the length of the decade. With this change, the average person had a lot more money to spend on themselves or their families. After years of battling the effects of Great Depression and war leftovers, the United States had finally got back on their feet and was thriving. The rise of money flow and spending boosted consumerism to a whole new level as Americans consumed 30% of the world's goods while only making up 6% of the population. With the United States being tremendously abundant in resources, companies focused on producing what the customers want. This benefited the buyer as they were getting the products they wanted, but also the economy as it created large amounts of money and jobs. It was a win-win situation that everyone enjoyed. In addition, Credit cards were introduced during this time, which led to even more spending. While much of the United States prospered during this time, unfortunately, there were many left out of the wealth and success. Eisenhower's policies worked in favor of the upper and middle class, but left around 25% of the population in poverty. With most of the world still trying to recover from World War II, America showed why we are the strongest country on the planet and now the most financially stable. On the education side, more people were attending colleges and state institutions than ever before. People were interested in furthering their educations and learning more about their niche careers. The government raised money to provide classes so that Americans would become more skilled and educated. This would allow the United States to compete in the international market and make huge strides in the science and medical fields. Not only did further education go through a transformation, but the fundamentals of education drastically changed. During this decade, the image of the United States was changing rapidly, and with that came alterations to the student curriculum. It became very important for schools to focus on mental and physical health, which is very different from the typical math and reading that had been preached for the past 100 years. There were many vocational programs offered with people being able to choose their career paths based on what they liked and wanted to make a career out of. This decade would forever change the idea of learning. To you, Elijah.
You're beautiful. You make me feel my Barbie doll is really real. Barbie's small and so petite. Her clothes and figure look so neat. Her dancing outfit rings the bell. At parties she will cast a spell. Purses, hats, and gloves galore. And all the gadgets gals adore.
Barbie dressed for swimmin' fun is only $3.
Thank you, Aiden. Well, looking over the course of the past decade, we have made great strides in detecting and even curing illnesses. The biggest breakthrough in today's medicine was the vaccine for the polio, a disease that spreads from person to person and attacks parts of the spinal cord that can lead to paralysis. The polio vaccine was originally developed by John Salk in 1955, which was administered by injection, later further developed by Albert Sabin. The vaccine was more advanced and could be taken orally. I took mine last year. Following the polio vaccine was yet another medical milestone. Surgeons were able to stop the blood flow within the body, allowing for the repair of defective hearts. For the first time in history, artificial heart valves were implanted into the hearts of heart-damaged Americans. Not only this, but the electric shockwaves were used for the first time to control the heartbeats, and later electronic heart pacemakers to control the pace. Following this was yet another medical triumph. In 1957, while the understanding of and treating of cancer became more advanced, a cure proved to be difficult to find. However, at the same time, the link between the cancer and smoking cigarettes was established and published. This was not good for the tobacco industry. Though there were many medical achievements made in the past decade, we cannot forget the introduction and development of antidepressants. Iproniazid and Ipramine were two fundamental contributions to the development of psychiatric and treatment of depressive patients. Now, on to decades and review of our government and military. John?
Thank you, Elijah. Before we get into our military advancements and political legislation, let's give a moment of silence for those that we lost in the Korean War. We shall remember those who gave their lives in pursuit of freedom. Former President Truman was our president at the start of the decade. However, he did not decide to run again in 1952, which led our current president, Republican President Dwight Eisenhower, to continue to lead us to the beginning of this year. I'm excited to see who will take the upcoming seat in this upcoming election. I heard a young buck is a young prospect. As Elena stated earlier, the civil rights movement is pushing for change. The 1954 Brown versus Board of Education case, settled in the Supreme Court, allowed for the desegregation of schools. That's a big win for society. The civil rights movement is pushing for equal rights and to abolish institutional racial segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement throughout the United States. We will see what the courts decide in the upcoming years. Who knows what will happen? In other news, war seems way too close for comfort. The Korean War came to a standstill in 1953 after a truce was signed, which gave no clear victor on who wins. However, South Korea did expand their territory by over 1,500 kilometers. Let's see how tensions between the two countries come in the upcoming years. The Communist Party is indeed on the rise. With the Cold War, the tensions between the United States and Russia are rising. Who knows what will occur at this point? Nuclear war? All-out battleground warfare? Who knows? Just make sure to report your neighbor if they are acting suspiciously. You never know where a spy might be. The current space race is ongoing and is competitive as ever. In 1957, just almost 2 years ago at this point, the Russians launched a satellite into space called the Sputnik. How will the US respond? Who will make it first to the moon? Many questions will only be answered with time. And that wraps up our government and military for this decade. Back to you, Elijah.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for watching Shot 5. Tune in later tonight for the weather forecast.